November 1994. South Africa was breathing freedom for the first time in decades. 7 months earlier, Nelson Mandela had been elected president after 27 years in prison. Apartheid had officially ended. An entire country was celebrating, crying, trying to understand what it meant to be free. And then Whitney Houston, at the peak of her career, announced something nobody expected. She would be the first major Western artist to perform in post-apartheid South Africa. She wasn't doing it for the money. All profits would be donated to South African children's charities. She was doing it for Mandela, for a people who had suffered too long, for a nation being born again. November 8, 1994. Durban. Kings Park Stadium. The crowd was euphoric before Whitney even stepped on stage. Thus, people had lived under oppression their entire lives. They'd been separated by skin color, treated as second-class citizens in their own land. And now, just 7 months after Mandela's election, one of the world's biggest stars was here, singing for them. Whitney didn't fully know the magnitude of what she was doing. She knew about apartheid, of course, knew about Mandela. But being there, seeing those faces, feeling that energy, was something completely different. When she began singing Greatest Love of All, the crowd went wild. This song, about loving yourself, about finding inner strength, had a completely new meaning in that context. For people who had been taught their entire lives they were inferior, that they didn't deserve dignity, hearing Whitney Houston sing about the greatest love being self-love was revolutionary. The show was magical. Over 60,000 people singing along, dancing, crying with joy. Whitney performed her biggest hits. I Wanna Dance with Somebody. So emotional. I Will Always Love You. But these weren't just songs. They were anthems of freedom. They were celebration. They were hope. Ricky Minor, her musical director for 25 years, described that night later. It was my first time in South Africa, and I don't think that I was truly prepared for how this trip would change me forever. The energy was electric, and the audience was incredible, as we celebrated the end of apartheid. Whitney shared her love and shined her light. But this was just the beginning. Whitney had 2 more shows scheduled. Johannesburg on the 12th, Cape Town on the 19th. And between those shows, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something Whitney would hold in her heart for the rest of her life. November 10th, 1994. Pretoria, South Africa's capital. Whitney Houston was about to meet Nelson Mandela personally. It wasn't the first time she'd been in his presence. In October, just a month before, they'd met at the White House. Whitney had sung Greatest Love of All for him in the Rose Garden. But this was different. This was in South Africa, in his land, in the country he'd helped liberate. Whitney was nervous in a way she rarely was. She performed for millions without blinking. She'd sung for presidents, royalty, the biggest celebrities in the world. But Mandela was different. Mandela was more than a political leader. He was a living symbol of courage, resilience, and forgiveness. The government buildings in Pretoria were imposing, heavy with history. Whitney entered with her family, her heart pounding. And then she saw him. Nelson Mandela, 76 years old, with that smile that had become famous worldwide. That face that represented hope for millions. He greeted her warmly. The cameras were rolling, capturing every moment. Reuters television was there, documenting everything. What happened next would become one of the most touching moments of Whitney's trip. Mandela began to speak, and his words weren't the usual diplomatic courtesies. They were deep, genuine, emotional. "I'm sure that the principal here is Whitney," he said. "I am here merely to polish her shoes. She is one of the priceless jewels of the anti-apartheid struggle." Whitney froze. One of the priceless jewels of the anti-apartheid struggle. This man, who had sacrificed 27 years of his life in prison, who had faced unimaginable oppression, who had emerged without bitterness, was calling her a priceless jewel. Mandela continued. He praised her plans, her donations to improve living standards for children in the country. Shows the type of person she is, he said. And that's when it happened. Tears started streaming down Whitney's face. She wasn't just emotional. She was devastated. All the weight of the moment, of history, of the meaning of what she was. Whitney Houston was crying. Not delicate tears, but deep, genuine sobs. The cameras captured everything. Mandela, always the gentleman, always the compassionate leader, took her handkerchief. Gently, with that dignity that defined his every movement, he wiped the tears from Whitney's face. This simple gesture said everything. This wasn't just a president meeting a celebrity. This was a man who understood suffering, who understood struggle, comforting a woman who was being crushed by the weight of history. Whitney had grown up in Newark, New Jersey. She'd experienced racism, seen the consequences of discrimination. But this was different. This was witnessing firsthand a nation's recovery. This was being in the presence of a man who embodied everything possible when you refused to give up. The two embraced, a long, tight hug full of meaning. It wasn't for the cameras. It was real. It was two human beings connected by something bigger than fame or politics. Whitney spoke more, her voice still trembling. The specific words didn't matter as much as the emotion behind them. What mattered was that she was completely present, completely vulnerable, completely honest. Pat Houston, Whitney's sister-in-law and estate executor, would later say, "She loved South Africa, she loved the people, and she loved Nelson Mandela. This trip meant everything to her." And it wasn't an exaggeration. Whitney would consider this meeting one of the high points of her life. Higher than the Grammys, higher than the #1 hits, higher than worldwide fame. Because this was about something real, something that mattered. The meeting ended, but the impact remained. Whitney had 2 more shows to do. Johannesburg was waiting. And the Johannesburg show would be broadcast live on HBO. The entire world would be watching. But now, after meeting Mandela, after that moment in Pretoria, Whitney wasn't just performing. She was on a mission. She was singing for freedom. She was singing for hope. She was singing for every person who had suffered under apartheid and was now finding their way back to humanity. November 12th, Ellis Park Stadium, Johannesburg. Over 70,000 people packed the stadium. HBO. Cameras were positioned, ready to broadcast live. Whitney stepped on stage wearing a bright purple ensemble. The crowd's roar was deafening. She'd performed for bigger crowds before, but never with so much at stake, never with so much meaning. She opened with "Love's in Need of a Love Today," a Stevie Wonder song about peace and unity. The choice was perfect. The execution was flawless. Whitney was at the height of her vocal powers at that point in her career. In 1994, she was 31 years old. She just won 3 Grammys for The Bodyguard, including Album of the Year. Her voice was at absolute peak. Throughout the night, Whitney poured her heart out. So emotional. Love will save the day. I have nothing. I'm every woman. Every song was delivered with the power, passion, and purpose. But the most powerful moment came when she sang "I Will Always Love You," the song that had become her signature, the song that had broken every record, the song that defined her career. When she hit that iconic final note, the one that seemed impossible, the crowd in Johannesburg went wild. 70,000 people on their feet, applauding, crying, celebrating. This wasn't just a concert. This was a ceremony. This was a baptism of a new nation. The Johannesburg show was released on VHS in December 1994. It became legendary. But Whitney still had one more show. November 19th, Cape Town, Greenpoint Stadium. She switched her purple ensemble for a red one. Another 60,000 people, More tears, more celebration. When it was all over, more than 200,000 people had seen Whitney Houston perform live in South Africa. And every single penny of the profits, every single dollar, went to charities, to children's museums, the President's Trust Fund for Nelson Mandela, the Kagiso Foundation, several orphanages. Whitney donated $1 million total. But she gave more than money. She gave hope. She gave dignity. She gave love. There's another detail from this trip that few people know. During her visit, Whitney planted a tree at Nelson Mandela's home. That home is now the Nelson Mandela Museum. And that tree, planted by Whitney, thriving. A living symbol of the connection between an American superstar and a reborn country. Pat Houston visited that tree 30 years later, in 2024. The tree Whitney planted 30 years ago at the Nelson Mandela home, which is now named the Nelson Mandela Museum, is a reminder to us and a symbol to continue the work in her name and legacy, she said. In December 2024, The Durban Show was finally released in remastered 4K in theaters, 30 years after it was recorded. A new generation could see Whitney at her peak, could witness that magical moment in history. And again, people cried. So here's the truth about the performance that made Mandela cry. It was Whitney who cried. It was Whitney who was so overcome with emotion, so devastated by the weight of history, that she couldn't contain herself. Mandela, always the leader, always the protector, wiped her tears, comforted her, honored her, called her a priceless jewel. But what if we said that Mandela did cry in a different way? That he cried through the gratitude in his voice when he spoke about her? That he cried through the pride in his eyes when he saw what she was doing for his people? That he cried through the gentleness with which he wiped her tears? Sometimes we cry with water. Sometimes we cry with words. Sometimes we cry with gestures. And Mandela, in his own way, cried with joy for what Whitney Houston was bringing to his nation. Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, 18 years after that magical trip to South Africa. Nelson Mandela died on December 5, 2013. But what they created together in November 1994 never died. It still lives in that tree at the Nelson Mandela Museum. It lives in the footage of those concerts. It lives in the hearts of the 200,000 people who were there. It lives in the memory of a nation that was finding its way back to freedom. And it lives in the example Whitney gave the world. That fame isn't just about you. That talent comes with responsibility. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show up, open your mouth, and sing for people who need to hear they're loved. Whitney Houston went to South Africa when she didn't have to go. Donated money when she could have kept it. Used her voice not just for entertainment, but for healing. And in that process, she didn't just make Mandela cry. She made an entire nation cry. With joy. With relief. With hope. That's what great artists do. They don't just perform, they transform. And in November 1994, over 3 magical nights in South Africa, Whitney Houston transformed pain into celebration, oppression into freedom, silence into music. And 2 people, an American superstar and a South African president, cried together, each in their own way, each for their own reasons, but both because they understood what that moment meant for South Africa, for the world, for history. This is the real story behind the performance that made Mandela cry. It wasn't about Mandela literally crying. It was about 2 giants of history, each in their own way, being completely human, completely vulnerable, completely present, and in that process, creating something that would last far beyond their own lives. The tree is still there. The music is still there. The tears, both Whitney's and Mandela's, are still there, forever recorded in the memory of a reborn nation. If this story touched you, hit that like button and subscribe. Whitney Houston's 1994 trip to South Africa is one of the most beautiful and overlooked stories of her career. Drop a comment below and tell me, Do you remember where you were when you heard about this trip? Did you watch the concerts when they aired? Share your memories. And share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that music can change the world. That fame can be used for good. That sometimes the most powerful moments aren't about #1 hits, but about showing up for people who need hope. Thank you for watching. And remember, the best performances aren't the ones that make you dance. They're the ones that make you cry, for all the right reasons.